Okay, you did the fitting, you did the mock-up, you know what needs to change, kinda. Now, how do you take that information and change it back to the pattern so that when you cut the real thing, it now fits how you want it to fit? This is the number one question that I get asked when talking about doing fitting and making fitting adjustments. So don't worry, I got you with tip number 3, oldie but goodie from the vault of Tricky Thursdays at Creative Costume Academy. So let's dive in and see how do we do this very important step. You did the fitting, you know what you want to change, now what? Today for Tricky Thursday, we are going to take those fitting adjustments you made in the fitting and correct your pattern. If you are new around here, hi, my name is Trisha. I'm the owner of Creative Costume Academy, and it is my pleasure to share my pattern making knowledge with you so that you can learn that it can be easy to learn pattern making, how to do the tips and tricks, and start implementing it right away. And today, on Thursdays, we give a special tip or trick away for Tricky Thursdays. A little disclaimer about what adjustments I'm sharing with you today. First is I always highly recommend that you do a mock-up, and you'll see why in a second. And the other thing is I can't go over every possible adjustment and how to change it back to your pattern because everybody is different. But I hope this will help you next time you're making adjustments. So I did a fitting on little Miss Susie here, her bodice, and we've changed a couple of things. I'll go over what those alterations are. If you're curious on how and why I did make these alterations, I have another video coming up for you where I walk you through the top 3 adjustments you'll make to your bodice. Stay tuned for that. Let's get into making pattern adjustments. First thing that you want to do is mark both sides of your safety pins everywhere you made an adjustment. Also, I will be concentrating on one side because this pattern is symmetrical. So I have found the middle of my back that was on fold. I'll be cutting along this line and getting rid of that side. Next thing you want to do after you have your pins marked is take out all of your pins, and you want to clean up those lines that you've drawn with your pins so you know exactly where the changes need to be made. After you know where your changes are going to clearly be made, I want to let it out here at the seam. I'm going to take it in here is what that means. I want to take this dart of fabric out of my armhole. So I'm going to actually swing it down into this dart. I want to move this dart to here. We'll get to that in a second. So the next step, after I've made sure all of my steps are clear, is to start cutting my pieces apart. The goal with this next step is to end up with a pattern of what we want this to look like with no seam allowance. So when I'm cutting out my shoulder, instead of just opening this seam, I don't want this seam allowance to be included when I'm finished, so I'm just going to cut it off. Next, because I want where I put the safety pins to be my new seam, I'm going to cut along those seam lines. Starting to get there. The next thing is I still have a dart sewn in this back bodice. So what I'm going to do, instead of opening it up again, I'm going to cut along one side of the dart so that the muslin can lay flat. I did leave some extra seam allowance so I could pin my front closed. So I'm going to cut that off. Now that that is cut off, I want to look at this dart. Now, since I want this dart to end up over here, instead of cutting this dart open, I'm going to cut where I want this line to go. You can see that it's still cupping. It doesn't want to lay flat because that's what darts do. So once I cut this, you'll see what happens. By cutting where I want the dart to go, there is a little bubble here, but you can get that ironed out of the way. You can see that now it lays flat. So now where that dart was is now where I want it to be. For this one, I'm going to leave it here and I'll show you on paper what we're going to do. By cutting off all of the seam allowance and having the seam allowance marked on your pattern, I can see where I did not make changes and where I did make changes. So what the next step is to draw in where those changes are. Here, where I extended out at the side seam, here where I came in at the side seam, and where I want my new dart placement to be. I have drawn in my new dart, my new side seam, and copied this dart here. The purple are the lines that now I want to go by because that's what works for me. I don't want to keep this dart here, so I'm going to do basic dart manipulation to move that dart, that's extra fullness that I don't want in my armhole. Close this. with that closed, this now is the dart that I want. And I can blend and true all of these lines. I did the same thing for the back. Since I didn't move the dart at all, it was only changing this side here. After I've made all the adjustments I care to make, I want to make sure I walk my seams and either take off the remaining seam allowance or back off your dart, add in the seam allowance that you need, and work from there. By doing a mock-up, cutting it up, and laying it back on your pattern, this is the easiest way that I have found to know what changes need to be made and make them accurately. I hope you found this tip handy and helpful. Make sure to save this post for the next time you are trying to make adjustments back to your pattern. And thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.